Loui is going to be good. He's not great yet, though. And then that becomes, oh, you hate him. No, I think he's going to be really good. It's just he has limitations. But what I will say, though, is that he's looked better. Each call up, I thought he looked better on the second than the first, and I think he looks better on the third than the second. So that's what you want to see, and that's going to change the conversation. I think he's the true wild card here for this team down the stretch.
Poke the Bear is powered by Prize Picks, the exclusive daily fantasy partner of the CLNS Media Network.
And welcome into Poke the Bear, episode 208, presented by CLNS Media and sponsored by our good friends over at Prize Picks and Factor Meals. My name is Conor Ryan, and today we are once again joined by 98.5 The Sports Hub's Ty Anderson. Ty, what's going on?
What's up, man? How are we doing today?
I'm doing swell, Ty. I'm doing swell. I think Bruins fans have hopefully mellowed out a little bit. Seems like it's usually not the case, but the Bruins at long last did not go to overtime, did not lose a game. They did blow a lead again. That is true. We cannot deny that. But the fact that the Bruins finally got over the hump, beat the Vegas Golden Knights 5-4 on Thursday night at the Garden, seemed like a step in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, but I think if you're the Bruins, the way that you've had so much tough sledding as of late, you'll take a win like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you're slumping, you don't care how you get it, as long as you get it. If you get the win, you get the win. And then you try to build off that and stack up your wins and focus on, fine-tuning them or fine-tuning them and really kind of, getting a really great win. But you just want to get off the schneide and you want to feel good about your game. And I think the Bruins feel good. They don't feel great, but they feel good. Beating a team like Vegas, when it really looked like it was going to slip away from you, you'll take that every day of the week. And yeah, sure, Vegas, no Mark Stone, no Jack Eichel, as we know. Aiden Hill didn't have his best night, but you won the game. And at the end of the day, that's what's most important, to pull yourself out of the slump. You can't break out of it without a win. And so now they got one, and now it's about rolling it into something bigger here.
Yeah, no, and I think especially look at the way that game was going on. I think we both said it, watching from the ninth level. There was about 3 or 4 times where we saw a sequence play out. We're like, all right, we've seen this script before. We know how this is going to friggin' end. And I think especially when you got Grzelcyk sent to the penalty box there with 2 minutes and 59 seconds left. They're going to pull the goalie. We all knew it was coming, right? We all felt like that was all but inevitable, especially when you look at the way this team has played. But give credit to them. Like, they had guys step up. You had a clutch block late, I think, from Zacha. You had a few plays where I think Coyle was really strong on those last minutes, got some timely saves, which you desperately need from Jeremy Swayman. It just seems like, again, it's a game in, February 29th. It's the dog days. We all know that. But in terms of building your game, right, that's the biggest thing. We've mentioned these continued third period leads getting decimated here, and how if you don't fix them now, they're going to creep up again in April. For you to at least have a sequence like this where you're able to kill plays, negate how many pucks get to Jeremy Swayman, come away with 2 points. Yes, it's in the middle of the season right now, but at least it's building towards something greater, that when you inevitably face that in the playoffs, there's going to be a whole bunch of sequences like that where people are going to be sick to their stomach, throwing up in the stands as you got an empty net. It's good to at least get the results in a situation like that where guys stepped up.
100%. And I think you look at this team, this is kind of the games that they know they have to win, the style that they have to win. They've talked about this from the beginning of the year. Like, they know they're going to have a lot more close finishes, a lot more games that are decided by one goal. You got to grind it out late. And that's what you saw. And, for me, the biggest thing last night was that you look at sort of what's gone on in Vancouver, what went on in Seattle, losing key situational D zone draws, and the Bruins can still improve in that regard defensively with their face-off metrics and what have you. But ultimately, you look at Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha as your bedrocks down the middle. And what did they do last night? They went a combined 11 for 14 in the defensive zone at faceoffs. That is what you need. You need that from this group, and you got it last night. So I think that's kind of, that's something to build off of for those guys. Like Jim Montgomery, because of the lines and injuries and the cap, he's constantly readjusting what he's doing. if he can rely on Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha to win some key defensive zone faceoffs, that's going to take a lot of the pressure off the other members of this team, the other members that they have at center. Morgan Geekie didn't have a great night defensively at the dot. And Jesper Boquist never been really a great faceoff guy, but if you can rely on those guys to win some key draws, that changes everything. That changes how you feel about those situations. And, was it perfect? No, but you got the plays you needed late and really on the back of some of your best players, I thought. So, or players that you need to be your best players. So a win is a win. Just win, baby. That's how you have to look at last night's game, I think.
Yeah, and I think especially look at it, as you said, wasn't perfect, especially when you look at further down the lineup with winning faceoffs. You still get, of course, hat trick for Morgan Geekie, his first career one, and I think we've talked quite a bit about him and his impact and how much of a great bargain signing that has been. A guy that put up nearly 30 points last year in Seattle with averaging like 10 minutes of ice time. I don't know what the hell is going on there, but he's obviously realized, I think, his potential with even getting 14, 15 minutes a night. And then I think you look at the fourth line too. I think it was probably one of their better games as a whole. Again, a few D zone faceoffs that they lost there, but Bruins held a 17-2 edge in shot attempts when they were on the ice, which I had to do a quadruple take, I think, when I saw that on Natural Stat Trick. But it's an interesting kind of grouping right now, right? Where you've got Lauko back in the lineup. I think he had a really good game. Montgomery said on Friday that was probably his best all-around game. Boquist has been very productive. Brazeau, you kind of know what to expect from him as a big body, but you kind of raised an interesting question to Montgomery on Friday during their practice before they went out to Long Island about just the identity of that fourth line. It does seem like the way he phrased it, it's not like years past where, it's the Merlot line or this like super physical line. It has to kind of be with whatever your roster. It seems like Montgomery's taking a pretty malleable approach to what they're really looking for out of that fourth line.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of look at this team, the moving parts they've had on their fourth line, the constant juggling and what have you. And I think it's hurt them at times. I think it's hurt them not having a fourth line identity that you can, they're going to do this well. And, Boquist, Lauko, and Brazeau might be the closest thing they have to replicating, the start of the year where you want two speed guys and a big body. The big body they had on night one is not going to be back. We all know that. So, yeah. And the salary cap is currently keeping, Johnny Beecher down in the minors. So this is the best they can do. This is a, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but this is a dollar store version of what you had as your ideal fourth line on opening night. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as they're productive. And I think you're beginning to see that this is a line that maybe you can't lean on as strong defensively, but they can make some noise with their speed, with how they attack pucks and attack defensemen. It's a different kind of anxiety. It's not the kind that makes you shake in your boots because of how physical they are. But if you have half a second less to react, that's an eternity in the NHL. Or I'm sorry, that's not an eternity. That can lead to some chaos. So as long as they're skating and moving well, you like what they can do there. So they got to keep bringing it. I think that's the biggest thing is that Lauko, Jim Montgomery's talked about that. Lauko needs to bring it every night. Brazeau's got to do it to establish himself as an NHLer full time. And Boquist is, trying to prove he's not a tweener. So these guys, all three of them, have something to prove. So they should bring it every night. And it's on them to bring it every night, I think, at this point.
Yeah, and I think Montgomery mentioned anxiety is the big, maybe that's the unifying, word for that fourth line. Where again, if you have more physicality there, you're looking for more speed on the forecheck. Like anxieties, I think they're trying to get there. And it's almost like if they can be almost, I look at like Carolina and how they've been. Obviously, they've up and down and been very fast, but their fourth line I don't think has ever been like a bruising group. But they're so fast that they can cause chaos. And you've got guys like, Fast and Martinook and all these kind of bottom six guys that can move quick and kind of create chaos out of nowhere, can jam home pucks. Like I feel like that's kind of the approach they're going for there. So definitely something worth keeping tabs on as to how the Bruins fill out that spot, whether, it's going to be that same three guys, whether it's going to change moving forward. But another guy who obviously stood out rather on Thursday was Mason Lohrei. His latest call up, I think this is his third third call up, I think, this year.
Yes. Yeah. Third run. Yeah.
Gets the power play goal, obviously, a vintage play from a guy that, as advertised as a playmaking defenseman. There's still, as expected, been some growing pains, of course, on the D zone, but Montgomery seems pleased with how he's overall played in this latest call up. I think he's 5 games, 4 points. Played a lot with Carlo, which has been pretty encouraging as of late. I think they've outscored teams 4-2 in their 5 games together, almost 50 minutes of 5-on-5 ice time. So I think when you look at just what Loui provides, and this is maybe even looking ahead of the trade deadline, do you think Loui, and by extension, a guy like Matt Poitras, who's obviously not playing this year, but is still a good trade chip, would you view them as untouchable assets at this point, or do you think it all just depends on who's out there and who could end up being in a black and gold sweater?
Yeah, I think it all depends what the return is. I'm reluctant to move a guy like Mason Loui because he's 6'4" and he can make puck plays. Those guys, if he were playing on Philadelphia or Anaheim, you'd be saying, "Oh, can the Bruins get a guy like that?" And so to have his skill set at his size is impressive. I think the only situation in which I'm legitimately entertaining it is probably that if you're telling me that if he's the pathway to bringing in a Noah Hannafin and then extending Noah Hannafin, it's a bit more interesting, right? Because then you're talking about a guy who's established. Like if you're hoping that Mason Loui can become Noah Hannafin, that's great. Well, what if I can get Noah Hannafin now? What if I don't have to go through the growing pains? I can just get him right now. It kind of makes a bit more sense that way. But at the end of the day, I think the Bruins pipeline of bigger defensemen, they're bigger, yes, but they don't really have the natural offensive instincts that I think Loui does. Loui needs to work on his skating. He needs to work on his decision making in the D zone, but that will improve. So for me, it would have to be a trade that brings in a guy who projects the same way, but is already there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's even something now where I think we'll talk about this after our first break, but like you look at the deadline, and even if like you kept on a guy like Loui beyond the deadline, there's a lot of appeal as to like keeping Loui for the playoff run, having him kind of cut his teeth at that point. And you roll with the punches, right? Like, and I feel like every time we've talked about like, I feel like all season long for me at least, I've really hammered home the fact that like Loui's gonna go through these growing pains. It's not perfect, but like that's not to say that he's been like a complete net negative. Like we knew there were going to be these growing pains for a guy that's, I think really accelerated his timeline, switched from forward to defense when he was 16, 17 years old. Like we knew this was going to happen. And I think he's made strides from where he was even back in November when he was first called up here, that like, if you keep him in place, and even if it's maybe you're putting him with Carlo and all of a sudden you put McAvoy and Lindholm together or what have you, like if this is really going to be a bridge year, why not have a guy like Loui up there? You roll with the punches. There's going to be probably 1 or 2 of those D-zone lapses where you're like, but then all of a sudden he leads to, again, a power play goal on the other end of the ice. At this stage where you're already in this kind of weird season where, again, you're competitive, but you look at the cap and everything else. If this was a year where you're letting guys like Loui and, Poitras before he gets hurt marinate and develop, is that really the worst thing in the world? Because I think there's a lot to be gained from having him in those kind of minutes in the playoffs.
Yeah, and I think what's frustrating as someone who talks about sports is I've basically said like, hey, Loui is going to be good. He's not great yet though. And then that becomes, oh, you hate him. No, I think he's going to be really good. It's just he has limitations. But what I will say though is that he's looked better. Each call up, I thought he looked better on the second than the first, and I think he looks better on the third than the second. So that's what you want to see, and that's going to change the conversation. I think he's the true wild card here for this team down the stretch. Like, if Derek Forbort doesn't get his game together, and Matt Grzelcyk struggles, doesn't get his game together, and Hampus Lindholm is out, week to week, and they're not sure what the timeline is there, like, that's opportunity. And if he runs with it, he runs with it. You don't sit that guy. He's earned the opportunity at that point. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've kind of had to repeatedly make note of is like, listen, just because he's not ready doesn't mean I don't think he's good, But what I will say is that the third time around, he's been a lot better. He's been much, much, much better, I think. And he's close. I think he's really close to nabbing down a full-time spot. And so I want to see some more games. I want to see how he looks against Toronto, how he looks against Florida, if he gets in for one of those games as well. Like, he's got a few more tests, but I think ultimately, I think he's really close towards being a guy that you look at and say he's one of your best 3 left shot defensive options right now.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot to like about Loui and his game leading up to the trade deadline. We'll talk a little bit more about the deadline. But first, Ty, let's take a quick break, hear from our new sponsor in Prize Picks.
Football season may be over, but the action on the floor is heating up. Whether it's a tournament season or the fight for a playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of year. Get in on the excitement with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where you can turn your hoops knowledge into serious cash. Testing my skills on Prize Picks this season is the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $1,000 with just a few taps. Prize Picks is really simple to play, and I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. Download the app today and use code CLNS for a first deposit match up to $100. Use the code CLNS for the first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
Once again, shout out to our good friends over at Prize Picks. All right, Ty, we've talked about this for countless weeks now. By the time I think we record our next podcast, the trade deadline might be over. We'll see what the Bruins end up doing, but I think it's time to make our predictions. And this isn't going to be a sweeping, in-depth one. I think just overall, there's a couple of different paths the Bruins can take here. Stand pat, swing for the fences, marginal upgrades, what have you. What do you see the Bruins doing when we get to next Friday?
I think we're talking about a marginal upgrade, mainly maybe at the 4th line position. Those guys tend to not cost a lot. There's quite a few of them out there right now as well. We've talked about Liam O'Brien. There's also Brendan Duheim in Minnesota. There's Sam Carrick also in Anaheim. There's Nick Dowd in Washington. You kind of look around, there's a lot of those kind of guys out there, and I think that's kind of maybe where they're leaning. Obviously, if Boquist, Lauko, and Brazeau still look good, that may change things, but I think we're talking about a smaller move for either the 3rd line or the 4th line, and you kind of roll with what you have. I think they'd like to shoot bigger, but I don't think they have the assets to do it, and so that's where I think they go with it. Part of me is tempted to say they get a 3rd line scorer, maybe someone just a bit more consistent. But again, I don't know how you pull that off asset wise, just based on everything they've jettisoned the last 3 years. I mean, you kind of have to stop the bleeding at a certain point. So I'm predicting a small, series of moves, or maybe a small combo move. You bring in a 7th D and a 12 forward. You know what I mean? Something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm kind of on the same wavelength. And again, it's tempting to look at the guys out there, right? The Hannafins, the Henriques, guys that could really kind of change a key spot in the lineup. But I just look at the way the Bruins have operated for years now. Sooner or later, that bill is going to have to be, come due. And I think if there's ever a year to not be super aggressive or to continue to kind of draw from the same well that's already pretty barren, it's this year. Like, again, you can frame like this season, regardless of kind of what happens. Again, if they are up 3-1 in a first-round series and blow it, that's kind of a failure, right? But I think you look at just the fact this team has been competitive all season long. They're going to be in the mix. You've seen younger players make strides and take steps forward, like Loui and Poitras, that, like, regardless of everything, what happens this postseason. Again, I think they'd like to win a series or two. But if you tell me you go into next year with a whole bunch of cap space, you didn't give up your 2025 first-round pick, you actually have an abundance of draft capital next season. And you've got Loui, who's played 50-plus games. You got Poitras, who's 20, and, ingratiated himself to the NHL ranks. You're in a pretty good spot for next year. And again, who knows what happens in the offseason? Maybe you are able to sign a guy like Noah Hannafin. Again, I think that's all going to depend on, like, where Hannafin goes. If you tell me that he gets traded somewhere and he's still keeping his options open, if you're the Bruins, you'll take that. But if it's all of a sudden he gets traded to Tampa or Florida, then you're like, shit. All right, well that's not all that great. But I think when you just look at the fact that you've got a clean slate and a lot of room to really aggressively retool in July and August, rather than do that than really relinquish more draft capital, more prospects, stuff like that. Um, within the next week or so, I just don't see that being the feasible option after years of going against the grain with that.
Yeah, and the other part of that too, man, is that like, all right, let's say they still view center as a long-term need, and personally, I think they do.
Yeah.
What if you can't get Elias Lindholm, or if Pettersson hits the block? I don't think you would have the assets to do it to make that happen. But like ultimately, if a guy hits the market, you want to be able to get in on that. And if you can't do it with dollars, you got to do it with future assets. And so, do you want to trade that now, or do you want to hold out hope that, let's say in San Jose they decide that Tomas Hertl's got to go. Like they're going scorched earth and they got to get rid of everybody. So he's out there. You never know who's going to become available, right? And so I think the Bruins have to look at this big picture wise and say, okay, we're probably not built to win a Stanley Cup right now. If we do, that's amazing, but it's going to take some bounces and some good fortune, like it does for anybody for that matter. But I think you have to be realistic about that and say that you can't afford to keep doing this every year. And maybe, especially when your team is flawed. I mean, let's be honest, this team is good. I don't know if they're great. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being good, not great, especially when you lose the guys they lost in the offseason. But you have to look at it, from a more sort of even standpoint of like, you can't keep mortgaging the future. You got to pay the bill at some point. Don't let the interest accrue. Just pay it off now.
Yeah, no, and I think you make a good point, right, in terms of being selective with who you want to invest in, right? Like, again, it's really tempting to see Hannafin out there and, BC guy, Norwood native, a lot of appeal of putting him in your top four and having him there for the long haul. I'd rather you run the risk of seeing where he is in July and handling it then than giving up that draft capital, right? I'd rather you wait for, as you said, the white whale of a true game changing, centerman in a couple of years, right? Like, is Elias Lindholm that guy? Like, he's good, but is he like a game changing guy? You said, like, I don't think the Bruins right now would be involved in Pettersson sweepstakes, but what happens in another year or two when the next Pettersson, that next 25, 26-year-old guy with a 90-point season on his resume is out there for grabs, right? Like, what if Hertl's out there? What if Clayton Keller or someone else gets dangled out on the market? If you all of a sudden you have your 2025 first and you've drafted someone who looks like he's, tearing up the OHL or what have you, you have more of these guys marinating down there, you're in a much better position to box out some of these other teams as opposed to like, all right, we spent all this capital on Hannafin, who we could have just signed a few months down the road. Like, now you're in a point where you already have a really good foundation in place with this team right now. You got a lot of really key guys signed. You're actually seeing some younger players step up and carve out roles. Wait for that white whale to show up instead of like going for the swordfish or anything else that's right out there. It's just not. You have to be selective when you've got this platform to really augment your team in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit last night at the game. Something that would intrigue me if I'm the Bruins is maybe trying to replicate the Zacha trade with somebody else. You look at Buffalo, Casey Middlestat, they don't know what his future is there. You look at Philadelphia, Morgan Frost, his usage has been kind of bizarre, really for a little bit now. Could you maybe get one of those guys and take a flyer basically and say, hey, can this guy be part of the solution? Can he be part of the answer? Is it my go-to move? No, but I think in their position right now, that may be the play while you're waiting for that next big fish. Trying to replicate that kind of move where you really kind of sneak up on a team that, is maybe not happy with the guy because he's never quite lived up to the draft hype or the prospect hype, but he's a good player and he's a good player and you try to make him great. I wonder if there's a move like that to be made, in the meantime while you wait. there are other moves out there too. Like what do you really want to be? Game one of the playoffs, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a team that tries to outscore the opposition, with an offense, or do you want to try to win 2-1, 3-2 because that's your kind of team? And if you feel like you're the latter, well, then maybe you acquire a guy who can win some faceoffs, or you acquire a winger that has a strong two-way game. A name like that's familiar to Bruins fans is Riley Smith. Riley Smith in Pittsburgh. He was a great two-way player for Vegas. He can play the left and the right side. If you put him with Marchand and Coyle, okay, that's not a bad shutdown line in my opinion. Yeah. So it really kind of all depends. What do they view as A, their identity in the playoffs, and B, how good they are, right? And so I think that shapes a lot of things, but there's a lot of unknown right now, it feels like, with this team.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah. We're prescribing patience, which of course means that who the hell knows what's actually going to happen next Friday. So don't blame us when they do trade Loui and a first for Hannafin or what have you. Don't blame us. We had the rational, measured approach here, which tends to go to shit. So again, we digress. But
Ty, what I would say real quick, is that if and when Don Sweeney makes a move, doesn't it feel like it's going to be out of left field? You go back, right? Like last year, they were getting Gavrikov. Then they didn't. They made it.
Yarmo lost his mind, and then he got fired.
Yeah, but it felt like all the leaks were coming out of Columbus, didn't it? Because then Don Sweeney spun around and traded for Orlov and Hathaway. The Bertuzzi move also made in silence. Now it helps when you have two guys who don't like to talk between Yzerman and Sweeney. Two guys who prefer to move in silence, making that trade. But really, it feels like a lot of Bruins moves, especially in the last few years, really kind of come out of thin air, right? And so you're hearing all these names and all these guys that could be in on, and I'm spitballing guys I'd like to see come to Boston. It really feels like Don Sweeney is just going to surprise everybody, because that's what he does pretty, consistently now when it comes to his trade deadline ads, I would say.
Yeah, no, patience prescribed, but keep your head on a swivel, because who knows what the hell is going to happen next week. So, Ty, before we wrap up this podcast, let's take another quick break here from our other sponsors over at Factor Meals.
Get started on your New Year's resolutions with Factor, so you're ready for the new year. Factor's ready-to-eat meal delivery takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success in the new year. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from each week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and more, plus over 55 weekly add-ons, you'll have a ton of nutritious and flavorful options to kickstart your resolutions. No more wasting time in the kitchen. Not only does Factor offer fast, simple solutions when I'm too busy to cook, they also help me stay on top of my goals. With offerings like Protein Plus and Keto, I can stay on track. This is definitely going to come in handy for my New Year's goals. So head to factormeals.com/poke50 and use code POKE50 to get 50% off. That's code POKE50. Factor Meals, your go-to ready-to-eat meal delivery service. And now, let's get back to the show.
Once again, shout out to our good friends over at Factor Meals. All right, Ty, let's wrap up this podcast by looking at, we've mentioned the deadline and guys that they could be targeting. In terms of assets they actually have, we've mentioned, Ullmark before, and I don't think we view that as probably a viable option or something the Bruins really want to do. But looking specifically at Jake DeBrusk, right? Because I feel like we were both, like most people, I think, on the same wavelength of early this year. It's a matter of if not when they sign him. Had a great year last year. He's part of the foundation moving forward. Now, when you look at the fact that, DeBrusk mentioned earlier this week, hasn't, made any progress on contract talks, what exactly is going to happen there? Because honestly, I have no clue as to how the Bruins are going to approach it and what the best path is moving forward. Because if they're not going to sign him, he's probably one of your best trade assets. But again, if you're also moving on from a guy that can help you right now, it's kind of a weird spot to be in, I think, for all parties.
Yeah, I would say that similar to Torrey Krug, this is a guy that I look at and say you can't lose for nothing. I think you have to commit to him either by March 9th or make a trade. I really don't think this team is built to lose him for nothing. when you look at the assets, I mean, even if you got a conditional first, it was a second that becomes a first if the team you trade him to goes on a deep run. Like, you need assets, right? And so the thing I worry about is a sunk cost fallacy, right? Like, you've committed so much time to him, and he's the only one of those 3 first-round picks from that year that's worked out. And for that reason, do you say, well, no, we can't trade him? Well, what if he leaves? Then you lost him anyways, And so they need to, I think, come to some sort of understanding between now and next Friday, just to feel good about where you're going. I think that the idea of him being your own rental, I hate that. I hate that logic. It doesn't make any damn sense to me. He's already on your team. That doesn't make any sense at all. So you got to make a call. And it might be unpopular, but if you are a good, not great team, and you have doubts about this guy being here beyond July 1 at the price that you want him to be at, you got to see what's out there, and I've said this before, but like, if the team that loses out on the let's say the proverbial Jake Gensel sweepstakes, they're looking for the next best option. DeBrusk is pretty high on that list, I would say. A guy who can play well with star players and capitalize on that. He's not a bad player, despite what people may think. And so I look at it from that standpoint, and I say, okay, like, bring in something. If he's not part of it, bring in something that can help you down the line. And so it pains me to say, I think ultimately you do want to keep him. I don't know if you're gonna get as I'm trying to find the right word, because consistent's not it, but as surefire
impactful thing. Or
right. A guy who plays on the PK, who plays on the power play, can play the left and the right side, is basically a lock for about 18 to 25 goals, can get you 45 points. Like, those guys are going to cost $6 million a year, 2 years from now. So do you want to get ahead of it now, or what have you? So it's tough to put a finger on it, but I think you got to do something. If he's not going to, if it's no extension by the trade deadline, I think you have to trade him personally.
Yeah. And it's something too, where it's so, I feel like you're not going to get the full picture. We're not going to have a full verdict on this whole saga until he puts pen to paper on whatever deal it is, whether it's the Bruins sign him to an extension, or he goes to market and all of a sudden some team hands him a deal for 6.5 a year. Which, if that's the case, and you're like, all right, well, again, the Bruins have a bunch of cap space, but if they want to, deal with however they want to do with the goalie situation, if they want to sign Hannafin, they want to sign someone else like that, you can't probably be handing out $6.5 million to a guy that, again, is a good player, can play 16, 17 minutes a night, can do a little bit of everything, but you need just more of that impactful ozone play, I think, for him to warrant that kind of money. And it's so, I don't know if frustrating is the right word, but like, it does feel like, I think I mentioned this yesterday talking to you, like, if the Bruins put pen to paper on a deal with DeBrusk between now and Friday to some, whatever it is, $5.5 million for 5 years, would it surprise you if DeBrusk goes off on like 5 goals in 7 games after that? Like, I think clearly the thing that you take from his media availability earlier this week, it's like, it's clearly weighing on him. Doesn't know what's going on, where he's going. And athletes like that peace of mind. They don't want to be dwelling on these kind of things and are already trying to find their game and live up to, what their own individual goals and team-wide goals, especially. So it's just so tough to map out the best path moving forward. And I think it all comes down to what that final price tag is going to be.
Yeah. I mean, 5.5, 5.75, I do it. 6 million, it gets a little bit dicey, I think. And I've always wondered, could he want a 3 or 4 year deal that allows him to rebuild his value? Or is it like, nah, man, I'm not hitting the open market at 31. I want my payday now. And, it's really interesting. And the other part of it too is that, as you just alluded to, like, he clearly deals with some sort of anxiety, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's human. We all deal with it to a certain degree. But you look at the way that COVID impacted him. You look at the way that he's made passing mention in the past about how people view him, or how he felt about Boston. He clearly struggles when he doesn't have solid footing beneath him. And you might be listening to this or watching this and saying, well, that's part of his own fault for not being successful and not producing. Sometimes they go hand in hand, though. Like if you're not feeling good, it's hard to get that bounce, right? And so I think that's the hardest thing to really nail down with him right now. But clearly, I think it is weighing on him. The fact that he's talking about it openly, saying, yeah, I'm worried. It's like, all right, that is as brutally honest as he will be this year. And so he wants an extension. I don't know how the Bruins feel about it. I really don't. Don Sweeney made a very sort of, non-committal answer talking about his future. He says he likes him, but, they got to see everything, and they're going to keep that internal. If there's no deal by the deadline, I feel like he's a goner. And that would be, in my opinion, again, organizational malpractice in terms of establishing value and getting value while you still can.
Yeah. So again, I think by the time we record our next podcast next week, this Bruins team could look very different, or maybe not at all. We'll see. Again, you can never really tell when you get to this point of the year. So Ty, before we
real quick on that. Sorry. Don Sweeney did speak. We were at the game, so we didn't hear this. Don Sweeney did speak with Nesson either before or during intermission. I can't remember. He did note the physicality. He noted the fact that they would like to get a bit more physical. That's why I'm thinking fourth line or D with some of those guys that are out there right now. I think that's where they're going to end up leaning. Just getting bigger. I think that's what's going to happen between now and then. But we'll see. How do they get that? How do they bring that guy in? Who is that guy? A player I like, but I don't think they'll end up acquiring is Nick Seeler in Philadelphia.
Puck magnet.
Absolute puck magnet. And really fits their bill in terms of a guy who clears out the front of the net, a guy who will jam away at the front of the net defensively. And so that's a guy I'd love, but that price is probably going to be Tanev-esque, and I don't know if the Bruins want to do that.
Yeah, time will tell when it comes to just how the Bruins approach this deadline, what it's going to look like. And for people who I think want to listen to all the great stuff you have, Ty, especially when it gets to the deadline. Oh my goodness. Oh my God. There's a
little
deadline
monster
pickup already. Yes.
Yeah, there she is.
Hello.
That's Doom.
Hi, Doom. New deadline pickup right before we even get a week out.
Yeah.
But Ty, if we want to read any of your stuff, where would you or Doom have to say? Where can we find all your stuff?
You can find me.
She's trying to get out of the way now. She's doing whatever she can.
You can get me at 985sportsup.com. You can also follow me on Twitter /X at @_Ty Anderson. You can follow Doom if you follow me on Instagram. Oh my God, get out of here. But yeah, so yeah, you can. That's where you can find me. How about yourself?
Yes, you can find me over at boston.com, as well as on Twitter, X, whatever the hell it's called, at Conor Ryan _93. So this is episode 208 of Poke the Bear. I'm Conor Ryan. That's Ty Anderson and Doom, wherever she is. You guys have a great rest of your week.